In this episode, we start by reframing documentation as something that protects you, the organization, and the people whose data is being handled, because beginners often hear documentation and imagine paperwork that exists only to satisfy auditors. On the CDPSE exam, documentation is treated as the memory and the proof of a privacy program, and without it, even strong controls can become fragile when staff changes, when incidents happen, or when someone challenges whether the organization did what it promised. The phrase survives audits, incidents, and organizational change points to three stress tests where weak documentation fails fast. Audits demand evidence and consistency. Incidents demand speed and accuracy under pressure, and organizational change introduces gaps when knowledge walks out the door. Privacy documentation is not a single document. It is a connected set of records that explain what data is handled, why it is handled, what rules apply, what controls exist, who is responsible, and what happened when decisions were made. The exam expects you to know what kinds of documentation matter, how they fit together, and how they stay current as systems and teams evolve. By the end, you should be able to look at a scenario and recognize which documentation would be missing, what risk that creates, and what the organization should do to make its privacy program durable. A helpful way to understand privacy documentation is to see it as answering 5 questions that keep repeating across every domain and every scenario. The first is what personal information is involved, which requires inventories, classifications, and descriptions of data categories. The second is why the organization collects and uses it, which requires purpose statements, lawful basis decisions where relevant, and transparency records. The third is how the organization protects it, which requires descriptions of controls, procedures, and technical safeguards. The fourth is who is accountable, which requires role definitions, approvals, and ownership records for decisions and processes. The fifth is how the organization can prove all of this, which requires evidence that controls operated, requests were handled, incidents were managed, and reviews occurred. When documentation consistently answers these questions, it becomes resilient because it supports both day-to-day operations and stressful moments like audits and breaches. The exam often tests documentation indirectly by asking what should be done next, and a correct answer frequently includes creating, updating, or verifying a key record. This is not because the exam loves paperwork, but because documentation is the tool that keeps privacy obligations from being forgotten or misapplied. If you learn to connect documentation to these 5 questions, you will understand why each record exists. You can also think of documentation in layers, because not all documentation is meant for the same audience or purpose. At the top layer, you have governance documents, such as policies and standards, which define what the organization believes and requires in broad terms. In the middle layer, you have process documents and procedures, which define how work is done, like how rights requests are handled, how incidents are triaged, or how vendor reviews are performed. At the operational layer, you have records and artifacts, which show what actually happened, like completed assessments, approval decisions, training completion records, and logs of requests and responses. The exam often expects you to know that policies alone are not enough, because policies describe intent but do not prove behavior. It also expects you to recognize that operational records without clear policies can be inconsistent and hard to defend, because there is no agreed standard to measure against. Durable documentation aligns these layers so that policy drives procedure, and procedure produces records, and records become evidence. When those links exist, an organization can withstand scrutiny and change because the program can be understood and verified by people who were not present when it was built. One of the most important documentation artifacts in privacy engineering is a clear record of processing activities, even if different organizations use different names for it. This kind of record captures what data categories are processed, what purposes they serve, who the data subjects are, who receives the data, how long it is retained, and what safeguards apply. For beginners, the key is not the format, but the function. It creates a map of processing that supports transparency, risk assessment, rights handling, and incident response. If a data subject asks what data you hold, this record helps you locate systems and describe processing. If an incident occurs, this record helps you understand which datasets are involved and what risks to individuals exist. If an audit occurs, This record helps you demonstrate that you know what you process and that you have thought through controls and retention. The exam may test your ability to recognize when this record is missing or outdated, such as when a new vendor is added or a system changes its use of data. A record that is not updated is almost as risky as no record at all, because it creates false confidence and leads to incorrect decisions. Durable documentation requires not just creating the record, but tying it to change management so it stays accurate. Privacy assessments, such as Privacy Impact Assessment, PIA, and Data Protection Impact Assessment, DPIA, also produce documentation that is central to surviving audits and incidents. The assessment record shows that the organization identified risks, evaluated them, chose controls, and documented decisions, which is exactly what regulators and auditors expect from a mature program. These documents also act as a design memory because they capture why certain decisions were made, which is essential when teams change. The exam may test whether you understand that assessment outputs should include scope, data flow understanding, identified risks, mitigations, residual risk decisions, and ownership and approvals. It may also test whether you can recognize that an assessment done without meaningful input from relevant teams is weak, because it will miss key data flows and operational realities. Another important idea is that assessment documentation should lead to action, meaning the identified controls must be implemented and tracked, not left as recommendations. A durable program links assessment outputs to implementation tracking and later review, so the organization can prove it followed through. In an incident, assessment records can also help responders understand what data and risks were already known, which speeds up triage and improves accuracy. Documentation that supports data subject rights is another area where durability matters, because rights requests are both common and time-sensitive. The organization needs documented procedures that define how requests are received, how identity is verified, how data is located, how exceptions are evaluated, and how responses are issued. It also needs records of each request, including timestamps, actions taken, response content, and the rationale for any denial or partial response. For beginners, it is helpful to see these records as protection for both the individual and the organization, because they prevent mistakes and show good faith. The exam may test whether you can recognize that rights handling must extend into vendor systems, which means documentation must include how vendors are contacted and how their actions are verified. It may also test whether you understand that rights handling depends on data inventories and classification, because you cannot respond correctly if you cannot locate data. Another common test pattern is a request that conflicts with retention obligations, and strong documentation is what allows the organization to explain why some data is retained and how it is protected. Durable rights documentation, therefore, includes both the process and the decision logic behind exceptions. When documentation is consistent, rights handling becomes faster and more accurate under pressure. Incident-related documentation is a stress test because incidents involve urgency, uncertainty, and the potential for mistakes that can cause further harm. Durable incident documentation includes an incident response plan that defines triggers, roles, evidence handling, escalation paths, communication responsibilities, and decision points for notification. It also includes records generated during the incident, such as timelines, systems affected, data categories involved, containment actions, and impact assessments. The exam often tests whether you understand that incident documentation must support later accountability, meaning you can explain what happened, what was done, and why decisions were made. It may also test that incident documentation is not only technical, because privacy incidents require evaluation of harm to individuals, obligations to notify, and coordination with legal and communications teams. Another important point is that incident documentation should include lessons learned and corrective actions, because surviving change means improving after failures. If the organization repeats the same incident because nothing was updated, documentation has failed its durability purpose. A mature program treats incident records as inputs to governance updates, training improvements, and control changes. This is how documentation helps an organization survive the next incident, not just explain the last one. Vendor and third-party documentation is another place where programs often lose control, especially during audits and organizational changes. When vendors process personal information, the organization needs documented due diligence, contract terms that define permitted processing and safeguards, and ongoing monitoring records that show oversight. The exam may test whether you understand that a vendor's marketing claims are not sufficient documentation, because auditors and regulators expect proof through contracts, assessments, and evidence like independent reports and review records. It may also test whether you recognize that sub-processors matter, because data can be passed along to additional parties, expanding risk and obligations. Durable vendor documentation includes records of approved vendors, what data they receive, where processing occurs, what safeguards are required, and how incidents and rights requests are handled through the vendor. It also includes a process for re-evaluating vendors when services change, contracts renew, or new regulations apply. Without this, an organization can drift into non-compliance simply because relationships evolve silently. Vendor documentation survives change when it is tied to procurement and onboarding processes, so it cannot be skipped. That linkage is exactly the kind of operational maturity the exam expects you to understand. To make documentation survive organizational change, you need to understand the difference between documentation that exists and documentation that is usable. Usable documentation is findable, current, consistent, and written so someone new can act on it without guessing. That means documents should have clear owners, defined review cycles, and triggers for updates when systems, vendors, or purposes change. It also means documentation should avoid being scattered across personal folders or dependent on one person's memory, because that is where programs collapse when people leave. The exam may test this by describing a program that relies on informal knowledge or undocumented agreements, and asking what should be improved. A strong answer often involves establishing a central repository, defined ownership, standardized templates, and integration with change management processes. Another durability factor is version control, meaning you can show what the organization believed at a certain time and what changed, which matters during audits and incident reviews. Documentation that lacks dates, owners, and approval records is fragile because it cannot be trusted as evidence. When you build documentation with usability and continuity in mind, you reduce risk and increase resilience. Durable documentation also needs to reflect the reality that privacy programs operate across multiple teams with different goals and vocabulary. Engineers may talk about services, logs, and data stores, while legal teams talk about obligations and lawful processing, and operations teams talk about workflows and response times. Documentation must bridge these languages by clearly mapping purposes and obligations to system behavior and operational steps. The exam often tests whether you can connect documentation across domains, such as linking assessment outputs to control implementation or linking data inventories to rights request fulfillment. This connectivity is what prevents a program from becoming a pile of disconnected documents that do not help anyone. Another key is aligning documentation to risk, because not every document needs the same level of detail, but higher risk processing requires stronger records and oversight. If documentation is too light where risk is high, audits and incidents will expose weaknesses quickly. If documentation is too heavy everywhere, teams will avoid it, and it will become outdated. Durability comes from balancing completeness with practicality, so people actually maintain what is required. As we close, privacy documentation that survives audits, incidents, and organizational change is documentation that functions as a living system of evidence and operational guidance, not as static paperwork. It consistently answers what data is processed, why it is processed, how it is protected, who is accountable, and how the organization can prove its controls and decisions. It aligns governance policies with procedures and with operational records so that intent, action, and evidence form a coherent chain. It includes durable records of processing activities, assessment outputs like PIA and DPIA, rights request workflows and logs, incident response plans and incident timelines, and vendor oversight documentation that keeps third-party processing under control. It stays current through ownership, review cycles, and change triggers, and it remains usable because it is centralized, findable, and written for people who were not there when it was created. The CDPSE exam rewards this mindset because privacy engineering success depends on continuity and proof, especially when organizations are stressed, scrutinized, or changing. When you treat documentation as the memory and the evidence of the program, you create a privacy foundation that can stand up under real-world pressure and still remain trustworthy over time.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.